Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to another riveting episode of the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and today we embark on a fascinating journey through time, exploring the dynamic intersections of faith, fortune, and the foundational fabric of American society with returning guest, Smithsonian Associate Joseph Slaughter. In this episode, we are expanding on our recent interview with Smithsonian Associate Joseph Slaughter, who's the Assistant Professor of History at Wesleyan University. We dive into the pages today of Joseph's compelling new book, Faith in Markets, which offers a groundbreaking exploration of the 19th century Protestant revivals and their dramatic expansion of the marketplace. Today, Smithsonian Associate Joseph Slaughter will tell us about visionary entrepreneurs who, driven by their faith, embarked on business ventures that aimed not just at profit, but at molding a moral and Christian marketplace. From the sophisticated textile factories of George Rapp and Associates to the virtuous publishing endeavors of Harper and Brothers, we uncover how these pioneers attempted to weave their religious convictions with their commercial aspirations. But how does this historical tapestry relate to us today? Well, in an age where the lines between secular and sacred seem more pronounced, the tales of the pioneer stagecoach line, George Rapp and Associates, and Harper and Brothers remind us that the marketplace has always been a battleground for moral and ethical ideologies. Those efforts integrate with business practices today, and they integrate with religious beliefs that provide a mirror reflecting on our ongoing struggles and aspirations for a moral economy. This episode is not just a journey through time, it's an invitation to reflect on the principles that guide our modern marketplace. Are we building a world of commerce that uplifts, reforms, and unites? How do we discuss things like a living wage? Or have we strayed from the visions that once sought to harmonize morality with markets? Dr. Joseph Slaughter, welcome back to the program.
Thanks. This is the best part of my day, talking to you and getting to share in your community of listeners.
Right back at you. I feel the same. I enjoy this. Our audience enjoy this. We've talked a couple of times in the past. We just talked about your upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation, and you have this wonderful new book. I felt like Faith in Markets, Christian Capitalism in the Early American Republic required us to have another conversation because I think it's so good, and it's an important book and getting lots of great reviews. I'll mention one in a little bit. I wonder if you just give us maybe a little bit of background. What led you to this subject? Writing the book Faith in Markets, exploring this amazing connection between faith and economics in the United States. What inspired you?
Probably like some of your listeners, I have made the mistake of pulling into a Chick-fil-A drive-through line on a Sunday.
Me too.
Only to be reminded that they're not open on Sundays.
Yeah.
And at about the time when I was finishing one phase of graduate studies and getting ready to move into the research hardcore dissertation stage was 2014. When the Hobby Lobby case was decided. And that involved, if listeners don't remember or aren't aware, the question of whether the aspect of the Affordable Care Act applied to businesses such as Hobby Lobby, including also other religious-based institutions such as colleges and what we call parachurch ministry type organizations, specifically those that were objecting to healthcare plans that included contraceptives or morning after pills, those kind of things. And it was super controversial when it was decided. The Supreme Court decision affirmed closely held companies like Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby to be exempt from that particular aspect of the Affordable Care Act. But there was a notable dissent by Justice Ginsburg that basically said, history wasn't on the side of for-profit entities being able to claim a religious identity in the marketplace. That was interesting to me because at the same time I came across that dissent, I was, as a graduate student, reading lots of wonderful histories that had been written just in the last 5, 6, 7 years about companies like Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby, and maybe lesser known stories such as the religious connections to the growth of Walmart and other similar kind of enterprises that were much more of stories of the second half of the 20th century. And so it was kind of becoming almost a story amongst more of the academic community that these kind of businesses were a more recent iteration. And that was kind of what conventional wisdom being offered by somebody like Justice Ginsburg was also affirming, that this is kind of a recent phenomenon that businesses would claim a religious identity. And that while we have a long history of nonprofit groups doing this sort of thing, notably groups, say, like the American Bible Society, founded in the early 19th century, for-profit entities is a more recent creation. While I was marinating in that sort of conventional wisdom, as well as some of the scholarship, I was actually reading other histories that were highlighting in very sort of minor sorts of ways. They weren't focusing on these sorts of businesses, but they were just popping up in both what we would call secondary sources, things written by people, historians in particular, and then what we call primary sources, newspapers from, say, the early 19th century, journals, personal letters, references to companies that were being formed with specifically religious ends or identities in mind in the first decades of the United States, say 1810, 1820, 1830s, seemed to make me think, wow, maybe there is a longer history to all this than what some of maybe my academic peers are aware of, and maybe the broader American public, and for sure, maybe some of even our Supreme Court justices. And so that got me interested in trying to figure that out and figure out, are these companies the same? Is there a continuous line of these sorts of companies through American history? And what does that tell us about both our situation, what we have today in the marketplace as it relates to religion, and what maybe did it look like a couple hundred years earlier?
We're a country founded on freedom of religion, many other things, but it makes sense when you think about it. So maybe tell us a little bit about how faith and economics, Walmart, Chick-fil-A, Hobby Lobby, that's part of our conversation today. We're familiar with those companies. My family has pulled into a Chick-fil-A on Sunday and not been able to grab our food. How did this all shape economics back when, the 1800s?
As you're sort of alluding to, there's been a close connection. And even prior to that, into the 1600s, a friend of mine and mentor, Mark Valeri, has written a wonderful book about Puritan merchants and how pious they were and how concerned they were with how their business endeavors were fitting within their religious community, as well as what they would maybe describe as their personal relationship with God. And this showed up in lots of different ways. It might be sort of a providential lens, so that when a merchant's ships sunk in a storm in the North Atlantic, they interpreted that as some sort of judgment against their business activity. And they would engage in self-searching to determine what they needed to repent from to get back within God's good graces, so to speak, or debates within a religious community over what a local merchant was charging for a box of nails. And that person was brought up not just into a sphere of accountability civilly, but also religiously. We can find lots of these examples, to the point where in the 1600s, I'm not sure we would talk about a difference even between maybe Christian businesses and non-Christian, or religious and non-religious, because the lines were so blurry in that era, and that people didn't really think in segmented kind of ways where you have secular things and you have religious things and those kind of manners. But if we fast forward to the early decades of the United States, we find that people have very opinionated attitudes about the nature of marketplace interactions and exchange, and that this was a time period in the early decades of the 19th century when the marketplace was growing exponentially. And so people were increasingly confronting issues that, while maybe sources of friction and debate in the past, were rising to the levels of urgency in their minds. And a good example of this would be the construction of the Erie Canal in the 1820s, which, while today is technologically obsolete and sort of paralleled by the New York Thruway, was a marvel of its time and led to the expansion of the marketplace in places like upstate New York, because it connected them through the Hudson River with New York City. And it led to the explosion of New York City as the economic engine of the Eastern Seaboard in an era when it was outpaced by Philadelphia and Baltimore and Boston and other places. What that meant for religious Americans was, because you were now connected to the marketplace on what we would say maybe the periphery in a place like Rochester that was booming overnight, or a place like Buffalo, is that there was an urgency not to fall behind your competition that resided closer to the center in a place like New York City. And so the temptation to work 7 days a week became all the more acute. And the availability and the opportunity to do so was facilitated by the Erie Canal and canal boat companies that started offering 7-day-a-week service, and the stagecoach line that ran the mail 7 days a week, much to the consternation of many Americans, and would even open up the post office on Sunday, rivaling the only other thing open in a lot of towns, church, as an avenue for people to go and congregate and socialize and even do business. These sorts of developments, as well as the increasing opportunity to acquire things and to accumulate large amounts of private property and personal effects, made, very religious people think through the implications of, say, working 7 days a week, or owning vast amounts of property, or doing business with people you don't know and aren't sure if you can trust, in a way that in prior generations wasn't a problem when you primarily did business with people in your own town or city, or much not beyond, say, your own region.
And in the book, you talk about 3 distinct Christian businesses. You mentioned the Erie Canal. One you referred to is Stagecoach, the Pioneer Stagecoach. You write about that line, and you talk about Harper Brothers and George Rapp and Associates. What are the theological differences here? It strikes me that there's some parallels with the prosperity gospel, but how did some of the religious influences impact these early businesses?
I picked each one of those 3 for some specific reasons. One, Harper and Brothers, because they're still around in a form today and became the largest publishing house by some measures in the world by mid-19th century, versus the Pioneer Stagecoach line, which probably nobody's ever heard of and only lasted a few years. So I tried to pick some sort of diversity in terms of their longevity and how they impacted their own fields and market sectors in different kinds of ways, but also because they represented different religious traditions within the American experience. And so the Harpers are staunch Methodists at a time when they start as journeymen in New York City, that Methodism is a very small sect within Protestantism. It's very working class primarily. And yet they go from working class men of modest means to very well-off individuals by the mid-19th century, in a parallel to their Methodist congregation, which also gentrifies in a similar kind of way. Similarly, the Pioneer Stagecoach line that you refer to is more revolving around what we would call a Calvinist tradition, Presbyterians, sort of the older versions of Congregationalism. And for them, that was foundational to their view of American society and the marketplace. And then the third one you mentioned, George Rapp and Society, these are a group of German immigrants who emigrate from Württemberg in the early 19th century, not just to form a community informed by their, what we would call Lutheran pietism. Pietism meaning they had an intense desire to be very pious and live in their situation more separate from the people around them so that they could maintain their purity of their religion and community. It wasn't just about religion for them, but also about how economics factored into remaining a pious person. And that was distinctly informed by a different vision that was related to their particular religious tradition that was distinct from the other 2, even though they shared some commonalities as Protestants.
We've talked a little bit about Chick-fil-A already, and I want to talk a little bit more about them in a moment or two. But this Sabbath day approach, this business model that they have, is part business strategy. It's part moral approach to their business. How did the dedication to the Sabbath influence other businesses, maybe even societal norms in those days? And then did it contribute to the development of particular business practices? Was it a strategy just in the same way that Chick-fil-A uses it today?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple good, actually, questions tucked in there. One is, how does it become normative for us that the ideal is to be closed on Sunday?
Mm-hmm.
Because even today, although we have much more commerce happening on Sunday, it's still the ideal, if you're outside of the service and retail sector, is for your business to be closed on Sunday. That's sort of a normative expectation by the American worker at this point. But that was not where the trend was headed in the early 19th century. I mean, the Sabbath, especially in Puritan New England, was judiciously observed in, say, the 1600s and for a good portion of the 1700s. But the trend more broadly in America in the early 19th century was towards a 7-day work week. And that's where the trajectory was headed. And amongst a lot of other reforms that were launched in that era, abolition being one of them, of course, lots of anti-poverty, anti-excessive drinking, the temperance movement, for instance, anti-prostitution movements, all these different societal reform movements that grew out of a broader Protestant revivalism in the early 19th century. But for many of these revivalist-minded Protestants, the observation of the Sabbath was seen as key to all the rest, that they saw that as being foundational to living in good graces with God, that to work on Sunday was one of the chief violations of God's covenant with his people. And the efforts of people like these pioneer Stagecoach line founders, as well as other businesses like theirs that adopted what is known as Sabbatarian principles and not working on Sunday, influenced other businesses and also led to the proliferation as the 19th century went on of the blue laws at the local level that reinforced some of those traditions that dated back to Puritan New England, to the point where then we get to the early 20th century and even the Postal Service finally, with the aid of labor organizing, makes a similar decision that they're going to be closed on Sundays. Now, the advent of Amazon deliveries, the Postal Service is diverging from that, but that sort of consensus held for a good portion of the 20th century. And it was the efforts of not just activists who wanted to try to enact laws at the local level, but as I talk about in my book, people that created businesses to argue for that perspective and to try to create almost an alternative economy that could function just 6 days a week.
Hi, it's Paul. Do you love entertaining, informative, eclectic, insightful programs about culture, health, science, life, and everything Smithsonian? As part of our Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast, we're introducing you to the new Smithsonian Associates streaming series. Smithsonian, a nonprofit organization, is excited to present this new aspect of their 55 years as the world's largest museum-based educational program. Join us from the comfort of your home as we periodically interview Smithsonian Associate guest speakers. Our audience here on radio and podcast can explore our website for more information, links, and details at notold-better.com. Thanks, everybody. Our guest today is Smithsonian Associate Dr. Joseph Slaughter. Dr. Slaughter has written the new book, Faith in Markets, Christian Capitalism in the Early American Republic. We're going to put links so that our audience can find out more information about Dr. Slaughter, his work, and his new book. The book, as I say, is getting rave reviews. I found one from Catherine Lofton, author of Consuming Religion, and she says, the long history of free enterprise in the United States cannot be understood without reckoning with the history of religion. Dr. Slaughter's book makes a critical intervention in the history of capitalism. Just again, congratulations on this work. It's fascinating to me. I wonder if you came across, in all of your research, did you come across any data that showed that these businesses in early days were more successful against other business compared to other businesses that did not embrace some of these same moral approaches?
That's a good question. I did not do a huge amount of quantitative analysis in the way maybe a social sciences would do to try to measure effectiveness or success rates or things like that. In part, some of that's just being a historian and not being oriented in that kind of way. Another aspect of it was struggling to decide how to define success.
Mm-hmm.
And that particularly for a religious individual, they might not define success in the way that maybe some of us would, such as, how many different locations do you open? How many volume of sales do you generate?
Mm-hmm.
So I did think through that early on because some people had asked me that sort of question, particularly as it relates to a communal society like the George Rapp and Associates example, because oftentimes the way we evaluate the success of some of these communal societies is how long do they last? And that may not always be the best way of thinking about these kind of groups. And that there's probably other ways in which we can also probably think about measuring their success that's more in tune with maybe how those different organizations or proprietors or enterprises define success. So the short answer would be no for those sorts of reasons.
Mm-hmm. The interesting point that you make with Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby is that they are practicing some of these things, these same things today. And I wonder if you came across some research about the similarities and differences then and now, and how this is impacting us both societally and culturally today. We know Chick-fil-A doesn't hide their closure on the Sabbath, and they don't hide their religious-based approach to business. And so it's an impact that's pretty far-reaching.
I think that society has changed a lot over the last 200 years to where these businesses maybe stick out in ways that they didn't before.
Mm-hmm.
So an example of this would be maybe a business like Correct Craft, who produced the ski nautique competition ski boats.
Mm-hmm.
And when Walt Maloon started that company and adhered to and built it on Christian principles, as he then spoke about and wrote about in some books down the line, I don't know that would have maybe necessarily struck people as all that remarkable. Whereas maybe a business like that seems a little bit more either unique or peculiar because of how our society has become more pluralistic and has become more diverse, particularly in terms of religion or people not wanting religion in their life or not wanting it in the marketplace. So I think that would probably be maybe one point I would make. The second one I would say is that I do think there is continuity between some of the kind of businesses that I'm describing and some of the examples that you mentioned today. And that I would categorize businesses like Chick-fil-A as not being established with a reformist impulse in mind, like the Pioneer Company, but that they would be more similar to, say, the Harper brothers, who practice what I call Christian virtue capitalism, where through the products and the practice of your business, you're hoping to make your consumer a more virtuous person, that the products that you're selling to them are more virtuous and they make them as a consumer more virtuous, and that their experience in your establishment is more virtuous. So one subtle way that this might happen in a Chick-fil-A is if your listeners are attuned to modern contemporary evangelical worship music, oftentimes the music playing in a Chick-fil-A is kind of what I would describe a stylistic elevator music version of that, where there's no words and it's kind of stylized in a soothing, calm sort of way. But somebody who knows will understand that and recognize those as being evangelical worship songs. And so that sort of experience is kind of what that virtue capitalism, I think, can look like. And I would argue that it has spawned a whole host of businesses and even categories within our marketplace that also practice a version of this, even if it's not Christian. So I would say the original Erewhon stores in Boston and LA, or the original version of Whole Foods, were built around these kind of ideas. In one case, it was Zen Buddhist, and on the other hand, it was sort of a amalgamism of Eastern modernized versions of spirituality that informed some of those. But I would say Beyond Meat today is another example. If you've heard that founder, or Thrive Cosmetics, they have a very specific social conscience that they imbue into their products and into the mission of their business. I would say even, and I argue that ESG investing or even DEI policies and approaches to doing businesses are similar sort of offshoots of this virtue capitalism. And to the point you made earlier, I think it's fair to question and critique whether some of these are done just as business strategies, and some of the retrenchment by some of businesses from more explicit DEI or ESG strategies may speak to the bottom line motivations for some of those policies. But I do think that they have grown out of what was originally a sort of religious identity that informed business decisions as it revolves around what I call virtue capitalism. And they're no less legitimate, that I would say, and no less part of the history and fabric of the marketplace in the United States, even if they're not Christian or even what we think of as more normative categories of American religion.
You're a scholar of Christianity and capitalism and a professor of history at Wesleyan. I know that you teach a class, I believe it's called Jesus Chicken. And I wonder if you could tell us, I love that name too, Dr. Slaughter. I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about some of the lessons that we can learn from history in regard to Christianity and capitalism, and how we can maybe put those into practice, our faith with our business practices today for entrepreneurs. What are you saying to some of these young minds?
Well, that's a super fun class, because if your listeners aren't familiar, Jesus Chicken was a term that was used derisively by some liberals and progressives towards Chick-fil-A. And then some more conservative evangelicals sort of appropriated it as a badge of honor. And I'm not sure to what degree it's a common term that's used out there today, but it helps grab the attention of, the undergraduate mind.
Yes.
But the students at Wesleyan, if your listeners are unfamiliar, are what I would categorize as oftentimes very sort of post-religious, or for sure post-Christian. And even though the school started out as a very fervently Methodist institution and sent out missionaries throughout the 19th century, like a lot of the liberal arts colleges and universities of New England, it become a much more liberal, progressive, and what I'd say sort of post-Christian kind of place. And that makes the experience in a class like this really fun, because my students have not read passages from the Bible typically, and they're not even familiar with basic doctrines of Christianity. And so when we spend the first couple weeks reading what the Bible in the Old and New Testaments has to say about wealth and money, oftentimes they struggle to connect those to some of the conversations and discourse they see in the United States today, particularly coming from Christian spaces that oftentimes have loud, visible platforms. And that's a fun conversation to wrestle with. But more specific to your point, because a lot of these students come from communities where they specifically would not eat at Chick-fil-A because of the politics they associate with Chick-fil-A or objectionable entry points into the public sphere. It's fun to then try to think through the tensions of these things and then connect them to stores that they're more familiar and sympathetic towards, say an Erewhon or a Whole Foods, and see how many of these communities also wrestle with some of the same substantive ideas that are driving the discourse in the Christians that I study. And that's, how do you have a moral marketplace? Like, what is moral about accumulating wealth if Jesus seems to suggest it's pretty hard for wealthy people to enter into the kingdom of God? And by the end, when I challenge them to go out in the local community and interview proprietors of religious businesses, whatever those are. One student went to a crystal store on Long Island. Another student went to a Yemeni cafe in New York City that incorporated Islamic culture and ideas into their business. One student did, to their credit, go to a local Chick-fil-A to interview the proprietor there. And I think what they walk away with is a more nuanced and softened perspective towards the legitimacy of religious businesses in our culture. And that when they learn the significance of a botanica that's informed by Santeria principles in a Dominican community in Connecticut, and they see how it serves as more than just a place for people to buy and sell things, but as a spiritual and communal anchor, I think then they realize that these businesses actually do add to the fabric of our society and our experience. And maybe the alternative, where we have businesses that are just stripped of our own personal values and identities, is maybe a dystopian marketplace where consuming becomes much more materialistic than it already is, and that we lose much of the color and variety and curiosity of what the American marketplace has been through the centuries. And so, I think that's maybe a way of looking at it that can help us even sort of unite around maybe oftentimes very different ways of approaching, say, organizing something as basic as a supermarket.
Mm-hmm. It's a complex topic, and it's a wonderful one. I could talk to you, Joseph Slaughter, for a long time. We could probably talk about the idea of a living wage and wrapping all of that conversation into this. But I wonder,
Absolutely.
The book is so fantastic. Again, Faith in Markets is the title of Joseph Slaughter's new book. We will put links. This is just a final question for you. Anything that you learned that jumped out, surprised you in your research and writing of Faith in Markets that made you take a step back into this complex relationship and look at it a little differently?
I would say most of all was studying the people in the early 19th century U.S. who were very much informed by communal Christian ideas and who said the original church in Acts was a communal society where people sold their possessions, took care of the poor and the widows and the orphans and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And then actually tried to incorporate that, but didn't want to just be hermits who were sewing their own clothes and living very Spartan lifestyles, but wanted to be very industrious, technologically innovative in their approach to manufacturing and marketing and selling things, but they would live with very limited to no private property. And I think that what was just sort of challenging for me was to try to bring two things together that oftentimes seem at odds with one another, sort of technological innovation and manufacturing and industrialization on one hand, and then an antipathy towards private property on the other. And the degree to which they were both informed by a theology that was very tightly held, and that they went to great lengths to try to prevent the culture around them from shaping their marketplace approach, and tried to let their theology lead with them. And even though they were coming from a tradition that I was at first quite unfamiliar with, and particularly how they were thinking through these things as very pious-minded Christians, it challenged me to think about, on one hand, those two dichotomies together in tension, and also to step back and think about how they were thinking about these things as informed by their theology, and were every bit as fervent as maybe some of the Protestants around them that didn't see problems with these things that they had identified with, to the point where they never even gave them two thoughts. And I think that that's something for us today, especially if listeners reside in religious communities today where there may be lots of questioning of a lot of different cultural issues. You brought up the point of a living wage, but I think those are questions that religious people or Christians really should be grappling with, and shouldn't be afraid about asking hard questions of their theology and how much of their theology is actually relevant to answering and addressing these questions, maybe more so than what we first think.
Dr. Joseph Slaughter, Smithsonian Associate, author of the new book, Faith in Markets, has been our guest. I could talk to you a good deal more, Dr. Slaughter. This is just fascinating to me. I know our audience is just going to enjoy this topic as well as your previous topics. Check out our show notes today for more information about those topics and Dr. Slaughter's work, as well as his new book, Faith in Markets, Christian Capitalism in the Early American Republic. Have a great rest of your day, Dr. Slaughter. And I say this to you each time we talk, but selfishly, please come back. This is just great stuff, and congratulations on all of your work.
Well, thanks, Paul. Again, I love chatting with you as well. I appreciate your audience, and we'll definitely make time to do this again soon.
Good.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. To find out more about all of today's stories, or to view our extensive back catalog of previous shows, simply visit notold-better.com. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show.
Hi, one final thing. Please check out our website for this episode and all episodes at better.com, or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out your local radio stations to find out more about the Not Old Better Show on podcast and radio. You can find us all over social media. Our Twitter feed is Not Old Better, and we're on Instagram at Not Old Better too. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelsang, and I hope you'll join me again next time to talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. My thanks to Smithsonian Associate Joseph Slaughter, Assistant Professor of History at Wesleyan University. Dr. Joseph Slaughter has been a previous guest. Check out our previous interview with Dr. Slaughter for more information about his programs at Smithsonian Associates. You can find that in our show notes today. My thanks, as always, to the Smithsonian team for all they do to support the show. My thanks to you, our wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. And I want to have a special shout out and thanks to executive producer Sam Haneker. Please be well, be safe, and let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next week.